This lecture focuses on society and political culture in Canada from the perspective of the Canadian provinces. If political culture itself is understudied or misunderstood in Canadian politics more generally, the study of provincial political culture is even more so. There are only a few scholars in the field that are actually looking at this particular issue, and while there is some consensus over some points, there is a lot of room for academic debate. So today's lecture, we'll be asking, essentially, when we talk about political culture, we ask ourselves, how do politics differ among political communities like the Canadian provinces? And if you pause for a moment and think about how it is that political life in BC differs from political life in Newfoundland and Labrador, or how politics on the mainland differ from politics on Vancouver Island, for example, we're really talking about political life and political culture. So today we're going to go through three main points and talk about, first of all, what is political culture, and put some finer points on it, because as some of its critics have suggested, political culture is one of the most undefined or misdefined concepts in Canadian political science. Next, we're going to talk about how provinces might differ in terms of their political cultures, and lastly, a question that seldom gets asked: why do provinces differ in terms of their political cultures? To get started, let's talk about Canadian political culture more generally, and I would ask you to ask yourself, does Canada have a distinctive political culture? What does Canada's political culture consist of? And as we'll delve into more deeply in a moment, most people's answer is, after a lot of reflection, well, it's not American, right? And the very definition of what it means to be Canadian politically means to be not American. And you know, the whole definition of what makes up Canadian political culture has perplexed several scholars over the course of the last few decades, and many of them actually come to the conclusion that there is not necessarily one overriding Canadian political culture, but in fact several and many. And this idea that Canada consists of several provincial or regional political cultures really started to get some empirical weight behind it in the late 1970s, early 1980s, with the discussions around the Patriation and the Constitution, and a book called Small Worlds, which was edited by Richard Simeon and David Elkins. That book and others since that time have really divided political culture scholars into two categories. The first is what we might call the political character school. And people who study political culture as the political character of a community look for things like common values, stereotypes, things that are so deeply embedded in a political system that they're often unstated. They're often found in the symbols and ethos that guides a particular political community. We talk about Canadian politics more generally at the pan-Canadian level. I think most scholars and most observers would agree that Canadian politics remains defined more by its deferential character, that's rooted in its British foundations, compared with the more populist or Republican streak that we see in the United States. For instance, scholars have suggested Canadians place more trust in government authority than Americans do, which is one reason why Canadians are more willing to support gun control laws than Americans are. Canadians also pride themselves in maintaining a multinational, multicultural society. The mosaic character of preserving immigrants' identity stands in stark contrast to the American melting pot model, for example, where immigrants are expected to assume a more American identity as opposed to their own individual ethnic communities' identities. So that gives you an idea of how the political character of Canada is characterized in the literature, again at the pan-Canadian level. Another way to look at political culture is to consider the civic culture, or the political orientations of the citizens. And as we'll talk about in a moment, this school comes from, the title of this school comes from the civic culture books that were published by Allman and Verba in the 1960s and 1970s. And in here we're talking about orientation towards politics held by individual Canadians. And research shows that Canadians view themselves, and they're viewed by others like Americans, as being more collectivist and egalitarian than their counterparts in the United States. This is seen in some ways by the more universal character of Canada's healthcare system and Canadian support for it, and Canada's approach to marriage equality. The Canadian political character as a whole, including this civic culture, is thus arguably some kind of an American-European hybrid, because Canada's economic values are similar to the United States, but its moral values tend to be more in line with Europe. Let's delve more deeply into this whole idea of the civic culture school and what exactly is meant by it. Again, this is derived from a series of books entitled The Civic Culture, published by and edited by Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba. Here, they used a series of cross-national studies that examined the three things: the cognitive orientations, the affective orientations, and evaluative orientations of citizens in several countries. And they measured them in relation to individuals that exist in the political system, political processes, political institutions, and the entire system of democracy as a whole. So in other words, they were measuring citizens' knowledge, their preferences, and their judgments about everything from political leaders like prime ministers and party leaders, to processes like electoral systems, to institutions like civil services, and to the democratic system, as a whole. So what they were looking for, again, were things like citizens' knowledge, their competence to participate effectively and meaningfully in a democratic system, their interest in politics, their engagement in elections. They were looking for the level of trust that individuals in these various countries had. They were looking for the level of efficacy that individuals had towards the system. In other words, the sense that citizens could actually make a difference in their country's politics. And they used this rubric to study the differences between the political communities of countries like Italy, the United States, Britain, and several others. If we take that into the Canadian context, would we actually see differences in Canadians' attitudes across different provinces? Now, people automatically jump to thinking about policy positions, so let's look at that to start with. In the following slides, you'll see the data is drawn from Canadian election studies in the dates that are noted. Is there a difference, for example, in Canadians' attitudes towards capital punishment? And the answer there is sort of, but not really. We're getting into matters of difference of degree rather than necessarily differences in kind. So when it came to asking Canadians' opinions about capital punishment and whether the death penalty should be reinstated in Canada, we find that very few Canadians, actually, or a majority of Canadians in most provinces, would oppose the establishment or reestablishment of the death penalty in Canada. But there aren't a lot of systematic differences on that question. Ask Canadians questions about their support for private hospitals. Again, we find that there is some variation. Is it a substantive difference? We see some provinces jumping out in this particular graph, Quebec being most in favor of supporting the existence or the extension of private hospitals, something that actually goes contrary to our assumptions about Quebec being a social democratic political culture. And we see support for private hospitals is actually lower in Alberta than we might expect, which is the bastion of Canadian conservatism, as we heard in another lecture. And this is part of the problem with measuring political culture using survey data that is one-off, right? It's a one-off survey that measures attitudes at one particular point in time. There could have been something going on in Quebec in 2006, and there were several court cases related to private health care that may be skewing some of these results. That's why it's important not to conflate political culture with public opinion. As Nelson Wiseman has put it, political culture is like climate, and public opinion is like weather. And you can't measure political culture using one-off surveys like this. Same thing with opinions on same-sex marriage, and I could go through a pile of other attitudinal measures, not really measuring what we mean by political culture, which again is something a little bit deeper. We can draw, this is actually fresh data that's never been released. It's set to be published in a book coming out through UBC Press. We'd look at differences in identification with political community, and again, this data is drawn from the Comparative Provincial Elections Project, and if folks are looking for this data, it's freely available on the CPEP website, as you see on your screen. We asked people in this survey, how deeply do you identify with your political community? In other words, the question was, how much do you identify with Canada, is the one question. That's what you see in the black bars. And how much do you identify with your province? And we find that the percentages here are represented by very much or quite a lot. And we find that most Canadians across the country identify closely with Canada, the exception being Quebec. At the same time, that doesn't come at the expense of identifying with one's own provincial political community. You can see through the gray bars here that most people across Canada also agree that they identify with their province a great deal or quite a lot. Using from the same data set again, democratic satisfaction. Maybe we can measure civic culture by looking at how satisfied people are with democracy in their respective provinces and with the federal government. Here we do see quite a bit of variation, and I challenge you to discern some patterns here and see whether that in fact reflects your understanding of politics in your province and what that means. Another way we could measure it is not through attitudes necessarily, but through behavior. And this is actually a contentious part about political culture research. Can we measure political culture through behavior as opposed to attitudes? But here, we give you a sense of it. We find that turnout has declined in most provinces across the board, but that there are regional variations when it comes to turnout in provincial elections. Some provinces, particularly in Eastern Canada, feature higher rates of turnout, PEI being the highest, and in Western Canada, turnout rates are significantly lower, Alberta being the lowest, according to these measures. Another way we might measure political culture is to look at ideology in a grander sense, not just policy positions, but where individuals in different provinces place themselves on a left-right spectrum. Again, this is drawing from CPEP data. The question was, considering all areas of public policy, and we led our respondents through a bunch of different questions leading up to this one, where would you place yourself on a left-right scale, left being 0, right being 10. We find that there is some variation across the country in terms of where individuals self-placed. Most of them, again, hover around the center, and that's typical of the Canadian political culture more generally, being one of moderation and centrism. We're known for that, both empirically and among other folks that observe Canadian politics from the outside as well. But we find that there are some differences. Saskatchewan is the right-leaning most province, according to this particular set of measures. And we find that the left-leaning most folks in Canada are found again in Atlantic Canada. There are other ways to measure it. And again, I want to get away from this idea that we can measure public opinion as an indicator of civic culture or political culture. So we could take different snapshots in time, and I'm going to flip through these slides rather quickly just to show you that there isn't a lot of pattern when it comes to measuring things like people's interest in politics across the country. We don't see the existence of distinct provincial political cultures when it comes to interest in politics or interest in elections. And again, these are measured over time. If you want to have a closer look at these, by all means, press the pause button on YouTube and have a closer look. We don't see a lot of difference when it comes to the proportion of Canadians in different provinces discussing politics at home. Again, this particular data is being drawn from the Canadian Election Study. We don't see a lot of difference in terms of Canadians' media consumption, in terms of their level of political trust, trust in politicians and institutions and so on. We can get into individual questions that measure things like cynicism or efficacy, things like, do you strongly agree that politicians soon lose touch with the people after they're elected? Again, there is variation across the country, but that variation tends to be temporal. It doesn't seem to be a long-lasting trend to suggest that trust is lower in BC by definition than it is, say, in Nova Scotia. It seems to be a temporal effect here. Questions like government doesn't care a lot about people like me. Again, a variation, but it seems to be confined to particular elections. When we create indexes of all of these types of questions, this one is an index of political cynicism that ranges from 0 being not cynical to 1 being very cynical. Again, not a lot of variation, and that variation that does exist doesn't seem to persist over time. And there's a whole bunch of other measures that we can use. How much of a difference do you think you can make in politics? Again, a measure of political efficacy, same story. How satisfied are you with democracy? Again, seems to vary according to time more than it does by province. And same is true when we talk about whether the federal government treats your province fairly within Confederation. Again, variation seems to be over time less more than it is province by province. So how do we make sense of all of these these data points? To be honest, there hasn't been a lot of analysis, with the exception of Nelson Wiseman, who will, in his analysis we'll delve into more deeply in a moment. Not a lot recently been written on provincial political cultures, trying to group different provinces into different categories or types. That's something that the Alman and Verba school pioneered, was this idea of trying to group different communities into different types of democracies. The first, as you can see here, was Jane Jensen's attempt in 1976 to talk about where provinces were on different stages of political development. And political development theory was in vogue in the 1970s. Has since been discredited for a host of reasons we won't get into today. But back then, she had described modern political cultures being those of Saskatchewan, BC, and PEI. The main measure that she was using here was whether the politics revolved around the issue of class, as opposed to the more, as she puts it, traditional issues surrounding territory, ethnicity, and language. Simeon and Elkins, in their book, The Small Worlds, divided the provinces somewhat differently. They said that there are certain engaged citizen societies, as they put it, in BC, Ontario, and Manitoba that were more well-equipped to engage meaningfully in democratic debate and discourse. And they differed from the more disaffected communities found in New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland, who were less, I wouldn't say less equipped, but less prepared, perhaps less willing to engage in democratic debate, and healthy democratic debate as they defined it. Kornberg et al. In 1982 looked at stages of economic development in provinces. You can see that on your screen. And Rand Dick in 1991 compared the institutional development of different political societies according to these different categories. So there are different ways to look at political cultures in the provinces, and those are just some of the ways that they were done up to 1991. Question is, have things changed since then? And certainly the data underpinning it is likely to have changed. Whether those groupings would have changed, who knows? Another thing to keep in mind here, though, is that when you're measuring political culture, the tendency is to predefine your communities, right? And we often look at political culture through the provincial lens in Canada. And Ailsa Henderson's study in 2004 was really groundbreaking in that she said, well, what if we erase the provincial borders and take a look at how Canadians feel about their role in democracy, how efficacious they were, in other words, how they vote, how they feel towards political parties, how much they engage in political activity, how confident they are in their political institutions, where they place themselves on the left-right spectrum, and so on. She asked all of those questions and removed the provincial variable from the first part of the analysis, and just let the data tell her where are the different groupings of Canadians that are most like each other. And she found that while there is some regional component to it, it's not strictly provincial. She found, as you can see on your screen, 9 different political cultures that exist in Canada, many of which transcend or exist within provincial boundaries. So in other words here, cosmopolitan Quebec is a distinct society unto itself, pardon the pun. Suburban Toronto and Vancouver features a unique political culture that is more distinct from the others in this list than different provincial groupings are. So it was an interesting study of hers that challenges us to think of whether provinces really are that different, or whether we're imposing containers, as it were, when we talk about different political communities. But as I said off the top, the leading examination of provincial political cultures in Canada has been Nelson Wiseman's, who's built a career around looking at political culture through 3 different lenses. First of all, the formative events that make up different provincial political cultures, the economic staples that underlie those political economies, and the original settlement patterns that help to form the foundational fragments, as they're called, of those political communities. In other words, the key immigrant groups that that formed the foundation of those political communities, normally in the early 20th or late 19th century. And what he does, and again, I'd invite you to press pause at any time if you want to have a closer look at some of these charts. What he does is examine the formative events that made up these various provinces, and you can see them listed here. For example, Quebec, the conquest of Quebec in 1760 was obviously a defining factor for that province's political development, and also talks about how aftershocks have occurred in these provinces to affect their politics and drive them down either the same path, reinforcing that original path that they started off in with the formative event, or take them off in a slightly different direction. He also takes a look at the different economic staples that made up these economies of different provinces in their formative periods. And you can see here that the fish economy would have a particular effect on Atlantic Canada. I challenge you to think about how it is that fishing industry differs from the fur industry, which differs from the fuel and mineral industry in Canada, and how that can affect people's political orientations within those communities and the overall political character of that community. Because Wiseman does make several arguments about the effect of these economic staples on those political communities. Where he hangs his hat, though, is really on the settlement patterns that made up the original immigrant waves of settlement in these particular provinces. And when these immigrants came to various parts of Canada from the 18th century onward, they didn't just bring with them their literal baggage. They brought with them their ideological baggage from the old world. And so we found that in Quebec, in New France, and in parts of Acadia, settlers brought from France a sense of quasi-feudal conservatism that made up that province's and that region's political culture for quite some time. We find that stretching all the way into the 1940s, where Quebec was a very traditionalist, conservative society. That differs from the labor socialist element that was brought to the prairies by British settlers in the early 20th century. In the end, what Wiseman suggests is that different provinces, and he groups some into regions like the Maritimes, but different regions and provinces in Canada have different metaphorical images, and you can see them on your screen there. Quebec is Canada's new old France. Saskatchewan is the prairies Britain. Alberta is the prairies United States, and so on. And it's one way to look at how to identify these political cultures as being distinct from one another. And here again, he's drawing on the original settlement patterns and what ideologies those individuals and their groups brought to Canada in different parts. It does raise the question, though, whether these political cultures themselves arose organically and then political institutions like Canadian federalism were built around them, or whether the political institutions that were imposed, the original colonial boundaries which became provincial boundaries, whether those institutions have actually helped to foster the birth and then the continuance, persistence of those political cultures over time. And it's a chicken and egg question here, but it's one that it's worth thinking about, because I think too often, as Ailsa Henderson's research suggests, too often we assume that those institutions help to create political cultures. That's not necessarily the case. So that's what we've gone over in our brief time here today. What is political culture? We've suggested there are two schools of thought when it comes to it. The political character school, which looks at the ethos of the political community, and the civic culture school, which looks at the individual's orientations towards politics in a lot of different ways. We talked about how provinces might differ in terms of their political cultures, and then we've started to talk about why provinces might differ in terms of their political culture. The challenge I have for folks that want to think more deeply on this is, we know why political cultures start off being distinct, and Wiseman's research has pointed us in that direction. we know less, and political science has done a less of a competent job, or devoted less energy towards explaining the persistence of those political cultures over time. So we know that American settlers brought with them populist, libertarian attitudes that formed the foundation of Alberta and parts of BC and their early political cultures. But how does that explain why those impulses continue to this day, considering that those original settlers are long gone, have long left this earth, and immigrants from other countries and other parts of Canada have left their mark on the province since that time? We have to think more deeply about how political culture persists in Canada, and that's something that I challenge the audience to think about and to contribute to discussions in their classrooms and when they're talking about these issues with their colleagues from across the country. So with that, I'll leave off, and I'd ask people, if they have any questions, please do feel free, or comments, please do feel free to email me at jwesley@ualberta.ca, or leave comments in the section here on YouTube, and we'll get to them in due course. Thanks.